Hey everyone, joining me today in Southern California is Sean McCrady from UL Healthy Buildings. Sean, welcome to Healthy Air.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here, Eric.
So I want to provide our listeners with a brief background on Sean to provide context for our discussion. So Sean is Director of Assets and Sustainability, Real Estate and Properties at UL. Sean is a certified environmental infection control consultant, certified microbial consultant, certified indoor environmental consultant, and a LEED and WELL accredited professional, and also a Fitwel Ambassador. He is a graduate of Virginia Tech with a BS in environmental science. So Sean, to kick off, what sparked your interest and passion in indoor environmental quality, and how did you decide to focus your career in this field?
Sure. Well, I won't bore the audience too much with my life story since it's not that exciting. But look, to be honest, like so many other people, when I went to school, I didn't quite know what I wanted to be when I grew up, and started off in business and found it to be a little bland. Had a couple friends that were in the environmental science field, which at the time was kind of a new field, quite honestly, back in the early to mid 90s. Sounded interesting, so I checked it out, and it wasn't really till I got into my career, to be honest, and I kind of stumbled into it, where I started looking at indoor environmental quality kind of as an applied science in the built environment, and that's where it started to really kind of spark my interest and become fulfilling. It wasn't like this was something I wanted to grow up to be. It was really through experience, I think, and feeling like what I was doing meant something, and I don't have delusions of grandeur, thinking that the work that I've done over my career is saving lives like neurosurgery or something, but it was always nice to feel like at the end of the day that it was making a difference, and it was providing some good. So that's kind of when I was hooked, I guess you could say.
Cool. Well, you're a bit of a throwback in the sense that you've been with this same company for the entirety of your 20-plus career. So both when Healthy Buildings was an independent business and then when it was acquired by UL a couple years ago. What led you to Healthy Buildings initially, and what's kept you there for such a long period?
Sure, it's a good question, and it's certainly not what I expected, going into my career. And the short of it is, I was kind of fumbling around a bit like so many other kids out of college and figuring out what I wanted to do. And it was actually my stepfather, Peter Binney, who was with Healthy Buildings early on, who, in fact, we have a lab in our UL office in Fairfax, Virginia, that has his name on the side of it. So he's a microbiologist by trade, and he turned me on to it and said, "Hey, why don't you give this a shot, see if you like it?" And it certainly wasn't like a silver spoon situation. I had to pay my dues, and came on as a junior field tech, kind of a grunt of sorts, but got to travel all over the country and meet people and go to new places and learn all about the science behind what we do and the built environment and all that good stuff. And it was really quite rewarding, and through some hard work and some good fortune and a lot of good timing and luck, it seemed like anytime I started getting a little itchy, a door opened up and there was an opportunity, and worked with a lot of great people, and it was always sort of always felt very encouraged and kind of piqued my interest and kept my interest, and then through the acquisition with UL 2 years ago, it was like a whole new world. So I guess one way to think of it is I've been with the same company for over 20 years, but it hasn't felt like it because all of these new adventures and challenges. Not to mention that, as doing what you do, this isn't a static thing. It's not like being an accountant. No offense to accountants, but when you're part of a science community and you're part of something that's always evolving, it keeps it kind of fresh and interesting. So that's kind of the backstory, anyway.
Cool. So talk us through the roles from coming in, doing the grunt work, as you say, to where you are now in a very significant leadership position. Walk us through kind of the various roles and then some of the projects that you've been involved in over the years.
Yeah, sure. In terms of the roles, again, it's not the most exciting story, to be honest. But as I said, like many others, I came in as at a junior position at a young age and really kind of paid my dues and evolved into a more senior project manager with more responsibility. Got into more operations management. I was always sort of into finding efficient ways of doing things and better ways, so to speak, of doing things. So it just kind of evolved, went from managing projects to managing people. I was really, again, talk about good timing and good fortune. I was fortunate enough to be part of a conglomerate who purchased the company, the Healthy Buildings at the time. This is over a decade ago, from the founder, Gray Robertson, who was really a pioneer in the industry in a lot of ways. I was lucky, I was, granted, it was a lot of hard work, but I was very fortunate, had good timing, and that was kind of the next step in the career, so to speak. Took on responsibility for a service line throughout the U.S., which was the IEQ service line. And then with our acquisition by UL a couple of years ago, that has since evolved into kind of a more overarching director role, where there's other things going on other than IEQ, like energy consulting and commissioning and all things sustainability. So I pinch myself sometimes that I have been quite fortunate and lucky, and it hasn't just been through being the smartest guy in the room, because I'm usually not, to be quite candid. In terms of projects, again, it's been very much focused on the indoor environment, and nothing is as important in my mind when it comes to understanding the science behind what we do, like getting out there and doing it. It's so integral, and we've had so many people in our company before and even now after the acquisition and integration that learned what we do through a lot of years of hard work out in the field, and kind of evolved from there. It's been kind of our model since we started, really.
So since you started your career to now, the field of indoor environmental quality has evolved quite significantly, and even the term healthy buildings, which in some ways is kind of mainstream now, or getting to be mainstream. 20 years ago, that it was not mainstream at all. What you've been directly involved in the industry, you've had a front row seat, you've been a kind of participant and a leader, practitioner. Like what is striking to you about kind of what you came into to where we're at today?
Yeah, and a lot's changed and a lot stayed the same. I'll say that. I think one of the things. Well, first of all, the thing that's kind of obvious is that technology evolves, and while we're doing a lot of the same things in terms of testing the things that we think are important in buildings, 20, 25 years ago when I started, back in the day, you had a big, cart full of gear with stuff hanging off the sides, and it was, you had to take the freight elevator to get around a building and whatnot. And now everything fits in a shoulder bag and is actually, the equipment's better, it's more accurate, all that kind of stuff. So again, that's kind of stating the obvious, but that's certainly a big difference now compared to then. But I think just kind of fundamentally a big difference is that sort of transition from IAQ to IEQ, right? I mean, we still talk about IAQ all the time, and it's in many respects in our world of looking at the built environment from a health and safety standpoint, IAQ is kind of the biggest carve out, I guess, of IEQ. But when I started, it was all about air quality, and there was some water quality testing. Of course, water's always been important too, but the evolution, I think a lot of this came with the whole sustainability movement in the early 2000s of looking at the other things that are impactful to people in buildings, like the quality of lighting, the quality of acoustics, the hygienic condition of the building, where we can more effectively evaluate that now than we could before. So it's that sort of evolution of what's important from a health and wellness standpoint in buildings that I think has really evolved quite a bit. And then we look at the thing that I think is important to note as well, which is what's stayed the same, what's remained consistent. And I know you and I have talked about this many times in other conversations, where the things that are tried and true are still tried and true when it comes to what we do to manage indoor air quality and indoor environmental quality. And that's the stuff that we are hearing often when we're listening to the right people out there, in terms of what has the biggest impact, starting with the fundamentals, looking at the things like ventilation, filtration, and hygiene. I know it doesn't sound that exciting. It's old hat, but it remains arguably the most impactful thing we can do. All these emerging technologies and all the stuff that's out there, it's all really good to look at, and there's applications for most of it. But the consistent thing has been you got to manage those key factors of keeping buildings clean, keeping them well ventilated, and managing the quality of the air and the water and whatnot that's in them first and foremost.
Mm. So it'd be great to hear a couple, or at least one more story of really challenging IEQ challenge that you've confronted over your career, like through the lens of a specific project, and what you did and kind of what you learned, and how you've carried it forward to other stuff you've gone on to do in your career.
Sure. No, it's a good question. There's been quite a few. They start to kind of blur together when you've been in the industry as long as I have at this point. But to generalize a bit, I think one of the most challenging things, especially early on in my career before I had the experience from doing this kind of work, is that we meaning our industry has this often has this belief that you utilize the tools in your toolkit to find and solve a problem, where oftentimes that's actually not the case, especially when you're hunting down, let's say, like a funny odor, right? And this has happened time and time again, where you have every sampling tool you can think of, and you test and test and test, and you don't find anything, but yet you smell something, right? And the client has been dealing with this for months and months, and you're trying to figure out what it is. And oftentimes the best tool in your toolkit you have is your nose, quite frankly, and your brain. We can smell things at parts per trillion oftentimes, these nuisance odors that are well below any regulatory limit or health and safety limit. And it's getting down on your hands and knees and sniffing around and finding a cause, whether it's I've found everything from dead rats up in ceiling voids to something as simple as the sun shining in on the side of a building and hitting a plastic window blind that it's not picking up on a meter, but you go sniffing around and you find that, lo and behold, there's your cause. So I think talking about challenges and just experience and whatnot, it's knowing when to just stop, put your tools aside and kind of rely on your experience and some of your basic senses to solve a problem. A unique project, I think I would say, dating back to the early 2000s, that was rewarding in different ways, and it was, again, very unique, was shortly after 9/11, we were hired to do a terrorism vulnerability assessment downtown in a large metropolitan area, and I got to spend several weeks sneaking around, trying to sneak around security to look for security breaches, looking for places where buildings are vulnerable. These are big skyscraper buildings where they could be vulnerable to biochemical attacks, that kind of thing. So that was not so much challenging, but very unique and different, and I quite enjoyed it.
Yeah. Interesting. That's it. SafeTraces kind of comes from that biosecurity world as well. So it's a really interesting space. So what areas of the field do you get most excited about and kind of you find yourself gravitating to that are interesting, that you think are impactful? Because you mentioned there's air, there's water, there are various elements that comprise the field, but which of those do you think is most interesting to you?
It's a good question. I don't think it's one. I think it's all. And what I mean by that is I think it's all of the years of research that have kind of culminated into this. I think most people have probably heard about the research that came out of the Harvard School of Public Health, and taking this idea of the importance of indoor environmental quality, all those things that you were just mentioning, and looking beyond just we got to do this so that people don't risk getting hurt or getting sick, but you look beyond that at that productivity piece, and thinking about the global impact that can have, these incremental things that we can do, and how holistically they can just make such a huge difference in the world. That sort of evolution of things is what excites me. It's not just about people not getting enough air, but it's about optimizing the built environment to where you have better people, happier, better, higher functioning people with a better sense of well-being. That's the kind of stuff that really excites me now.
Yeah, and just to build on that, so I mean, right over the past year with the pandemic, indoor air quality has been very top of mind, and we're now living through an extreme kind of set of circumstances of how significant the indoor air quality risks are. But for several years, we've been aware of not only the kind of worst outcomes on a human level of poor indoor air quality in terms of death and illnesses, but also just things short of that, but are still very important, like cognition and how that's impacted by air quality, productivity, all that kind of stuff. And honestly, a lot of the literature cites many buildings, at least in the U.S. and in other countries, as being pretty poor in terms of the indoor air quality kind of environment that they have. Tell us a little bit more about how how indoor air quality, like how we should be thinking about that holistically beyond extreme cases of people living or dying or getting extremely sick. What are the dimensions of that? And then secondly, in terms of rating, or like your sense, broadly speaking, of buildings within the U.S. that many Americans are occupying on a daily basis, from their office to their home to other places where people are in all the time. I mean, how do you think our buildings are set up from an indoor air quality perspective? And are we at risk? Are we okay? Are we great?
Good question. Yeah, it's a good question. And we've learned a lot. We're learning more all the time. I mean, I think we got to look beyond the current situation and learn a lot from it, because history tends to repeat itself, and I don't think it's going to be another 100 years before we're in a difficult situation, unfortunately. But starting with the last part of your question, I think that the first thing that people need to realize, and this is not, of course, there's exceptions to the rule, plenty of exceptions to the rule where you have buildings that are just set up to fail. There's no doubt about that. But by and large, most buildings aren't set up to fail. They're just mismanaged, quite frankly. And that doesn't mean it has to be gross negligence. That means that there's always been a little bit of a lack of awareness and understanding of what to do in buildings, in your traditional building, whether it's multifamily or office building or a school or what have you, operating it to the best of your ability to promote good indoor air quality, right? You don't need to have some super high-tech building to kind of get you most of the way there to really kind of protect people and promote wellness and good IAQ. I mean, you think about schools, for example, most schools don't have very high-tech systems. They're these rooftop air conditioning units that are pretty rudimentary, that with open windows and whatnot, or operable windows, and there are some very simple things that you can do to really still have pretty good indoor air quality. Granted, there are challenges and whatnot, but so often we see where these things are just mismanaged. You're not bringing in fresh air because you don't want to drive up energy bills. You're not utilizing fresh air where you should. You're not, doing the right preventative maintenance on systems. Again, I know this stuff isn't that exciting, but it's just so impactful. So I think, I'm hoping that with this increased awareness that the general population is having, and then layer on top of that, people that are actually in charge of facilities and whatnot, hopefully they're evolving as well to just, if you do the best you can with what you got, it's incredibly impactful. And there's a lot, believe me, I've looked at thousands of buildings over my career. There's a lot of room to improve. I think that there's, not to go off on a tangent here a little bit, but I think there's this focus right now on how do we build new buildings so that they're state of the art and they can protect us. And that's great, that's smart, but I think we have to not lose sight of the fact that most buildings aren't new. They're not suddenly going to be new. You know, when you look at the building stock, by far the buildings that are there have been here for a while. They're not, they're not that innovative, and there's things that you can do, but you got to start again with those fundamentals and understand what you're doing, and it's going to have a big impact.
Yeah, so a follow-up to your comments there. I guess the short question is why? Why, if fundamentally it's a mismanagement problem and that we can do a lot more than we are doing, why are we not doing that? And a lot has been written on this and postulated of split incentives or just the various kind of equities within the building, ranging from the tenants to the owners to the managers to all the service providers within the building. I mean, there's a kind of complex kind of systems element to the challenge, it seems. And then secondly, there's just a fundamental philosophy of the building. Is it a financial asset? Is it ultimately about providing a product and experience to the occupant? Can you kind of tease out a little bit why you think buildings are so mismanaged? Like, what are the key factors that are driving that?
Well, I think for one, I think you just kind of hit it on your question, which is the almighty dollar, and with a lot of this stuff, it's about budget constraints. It's about deferred maintenance because you're running more lean to save a dollar. Maybe you have a great preventative maintenance plan, but you've got 2 guys instead of 5 who are trying to manage it, and they're just chasing their tail. There's the energy consumption piece. I mean, again, I'm hoping that a lot of this, some of the silver lining of this terrible thing that's going on right now will be that increased awareness across the board, meaning that people in the buildings are going to expect more. They're going to know a little more. They're going to ask for more. The people in charge of the buildings hopefully are taking it upon themselves to really learn more and learn what they need to do to protect these assets. But that's really what it comes down to. I mean, why? I guess maybe there's a profound laziness that's part of it too in society. I don't know, but I think, rather than figure out why these things weren't managed as well as they could in the past, I'm hoping we can look toward the future and change that. And I think we will to a degree. But the other part of this that the pessimist in me tells me that we are forgetful creatures, and as time passes, I think a lot of the good things we're going to do now, if we're not careful, will start slipping again, and we don't want to end up in the same place we were this time, because a lot of the stuff wasn't avoidable with what we're going through right now, but a lot of it could have been much more manageable if we were better prepared, and we weren't, quite frankly.
Yeah. So just switching gears a little bit, tell us a little bit about the Healthy Buildings business. What does the business do? How are you kind of organized? What types of services are you providing to your clients? That'd be really helpful context for the audience.
Sure. Yeah. And we are, when we say Healthy Buildings, we're talking about the healthy building service offerings within UL.
Yes.
And that's exactly what we're about, right? It's backing up just a little bit. The whole reason for the acquisition, quite frankly, the reason why UL wanted us to become part of the family was because they had such a large focus on this topic of indoor air quality and indoor environmental quality as it relates to products, right? And products going into buildings. And we were kind of that last piece, to the finish line, which was the real world, right? How are these things performing in the real world? So our services are very much focused on that. it's everything related to the built environment in terms of how it's performing from a health and wellness standpoint, a sustainability standpoint, looking at ESG reporting, at energy efficiency, all that stuff that kind of makes up the built environment. That's what we do. And of course, as expected, things have evolved over the year to, over the years to where we are now, which is offering some very distinct kind of solutions to people who are in charge of facilities around, not just around the country, but around the world.
How has the pandemic impacted your business? And what have you found yourself doing? Has it been a continuation of what you were doing pre-pandemic, or have there been some changes or alterations?
Definitely some changes. We spent probably a third to half of our time running out to buildings to solve problems, right? Because somebody didn't feel well, or somebody found some issue in a building, or there was a water leak, or a funny odor and whatnot. When people aren't in buildings, there doesn't tend to be a need for that near as much. So the things that we have been doing day in and day out have certainly shifted. A big part of what we started doing very shortly after the pandemic hit was providing advisory services and helping clients of all types figure out what they need to do to come up with sort of a pandemic response plan, and also evaluating facilities for readiness for people to come back. There's some important factors there that are pandemic related and that are also related to buildings sitting, kind of mothballed and not under normal occupancy. Things like water quality, for example, when you have stagnant pipes, that has nothing to do with the pandemic directly in terms of the health risks, but certainly when you bring people back and you start to use that water again, you've got all sorts of contaminants, you've got waterborne pathogens that can become airborne, like Legionella, so on and so forth. So we've been pretty agile to make sure that again, buildings aren't going away. The needs have kind of changed in the very short term in terms of what people need in this field, but we've just made sure to kind of keep our finger on the pulse and come up with those solutions, and it's kept us busy, let's put it that way.
And one of the big changes or big developments over the past year, actually over the past couple of months, is that you all launched a healthy building verification mark, which very focused on health and wellness, but it has several different components to it. Can you give us an overview of the actual mark and what prompted you all to launch it?
Yeah, no, happy to. This is kind of a culmination of things in many regards, and it's quite honestly, it wasn't something brand new to us. When we look at healthy buildings historically and where we came from, healthy buildings kind of pioneered the idea back in 1980, dating way back before people even were really concerned about indoor air quality until they knew they should be. But we kind of pioneered this idea of proactively looking at buildings top down, looking at air quality, looking at ventilation systems, and doing this kind of holistic inspection process, whereas it's meant to add value and reassurance and be kind of a management tool, rather than waiting for something to happen. If you get out in front of it and kind of flip that concern about the indoor environment on its head and be proactive, it creates a value add instead of kind of a reactive response kind of a thing. So we've been doing that for decades, and we knew what was valuable, we knew what worked, but it was very much a value add. We'd provide best management practices recommendations, change this filter, clean this condensate pan, your VAV damper's closed here, you have high CO2 levels, so on and so forth, and we'd give recommendations. And with the pandemic coming on, we kind of repackaged that into what we called a re-occupancy inspection. We wanted to focus specifically on the things that were most important when buildings are sitting kind of mothballed and there's a risk of infection with everything going on. We realized that that was very valuable too, but again, it was kind of a snapshot in time, and people really need an ongoing program to reassure people that they're doing the right thing and to provide value to their assets. This was the evolution of the verification mark, and this is very much what UL is all about, right? And mind you, UL doesn't, as I think most people know, UL doesn't just put a label on things. There's a pretty rigorous process of making sure that there's proof of concept and it works. So here's where we are, and we've created this verification mark a few short months ago, just kind of on the tail end of the summer. It wasn't that difficult, again, because we kind of knew what we were doing. We'd been doing it, and we just evolved it. Those recommendations became more requirements. We pulled all the, all the different agency and guidelines and standards and whatnot. So nothing is arbitrary. You're making sure you're meeting those thresholds for the, be it EPA or NIOSH or whomever. And it just made a lot of sense. We developed a few tiers so it could kind of suit different people's needs. One for indoor air specifically, one that builds on that and focuses on indoor air and water, being that water is so important, not just now, but in perpetuity, really. And then a third tier that also incorporates those other things that we were talking about that are very impactful to productivity, like quality of lighting and acoustics and looking at building hygiene and whatnot as well. So it's been quite successful early on. We're up to about 150 million square feet of built environment around the country that's committed to it, and about half of those have already been verified in short order. And we've developed some other iterations that are very much vertical market specific. So we have one for hospitality. We have one that fits better for retail. There's always, you have to be mindful of the nuance for different space types and different markets, and make sure that you're not just crowbarring things in, but you have something that makes sense. So that's it in a nutshell. We're looking proactively at these really important indoor environmental quality factors. We're looking at mechanical systems. That's kind of your crystal ball. If you're doing an ongoing program, you test data as a moment in time, but looking under the hood, so to speak, really gives you that crystal ball on how things are being managed. And it's all about performance testing. That's what's I would say is kind of unique about it, is that our focus is on how the building performs, right? And that's very much in line with sort of how UL does things as well. But it's an ongoing program, so it's not just a snapshot in time, and we're excited to keep the train going and see where it goes.
So your verification mark has entered what seems like a relatively crowded space where there are many different certification and verification programs, some of which you're accredited in, like Lead and Well. How do you fit into the ecosystem? How are you differentiated from those? Be helpful to understand, because I think outside looking in, it can be confusing of what are all these certifications, right, and which ones are doing what. So walk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. This stuff, especially if you're not in it, can get confusing pretty fast. So I would say that first off, there is value to all of the different programs that are out there. And there is typically some uniqueness to the different initiatives that are out there as well. And I would say where our program sits in this whole thing, as you mentioned, is that, as I just said, we're very much focused on performance, right? We will, and it's focused on performance of the built environment as it relates to the people in the building. Other things like, certain policies and having serving certain food in the cafeteria and having fitness rooms, all these things are really important, don't get me wrong, and that's where a lot of these other programs are really great, that they encompass those things. We want to focus on our niche. Our niche is that built environment, how it performs. That's where we have literally we have data on hundreds of thousands of building inspections, so we know what we're doing, and we know where we can have a profound effect in the world, quite frankly, when it comes to health and wellness in the built environment. That's what differentiates. Where it sort of complements is that a lot of these other programs they have a an option to do some of these things. Not necessarily a requirement, but options to do some of these things. So if people are doing these other initiatives, often what we're providing is going to check a lot of the boxes in terms of the performance testing. So it kind of goes above and beyond typically in terms of being more holistic, but it's that added benefit of picking up those credits or points or what have you in those other programs. And when you start kind of marrying some of those things together, then you start talking about a really powerful approach to managing this stuff in the building. If you're doing Fitwel and the UL verification mark, or well in the verification mark, or two other initiatives, whatever they may be, it's understanding what is important to you if you own or manage an asset, or are responsible for a corporate facilities team or what have you, and finding what makes the most sense as far as fit goes.
So you mentioned that already you've signed up 150 million square feet, which is really impressive. Congrats on that. Interested to hear your thoughts on how, given that you're leading the charge on much of the go-to-market, what has the market and kind of customer reaction been to, immediately some people have jumped in and saw value, but you're out pounding the pavement in many different companies and verticals. I mean, what has been your experience in kind of introducing this, and good, bad, ugly, what has it been like going out there and kind of getting traction on this?
I feel like, quite honestly, and granted it's early, the impact to our clients and customers will become more apparent when more people are coming back, and it's starting to happen slowly, as we know, with things kind of turning the corner to a degree. We don't want to get overly optimistic now, but it does feel like we're turning the corner as a society in terms of getting back to some normalcy. There's been kind of a sense of relief a little bit, has been the feeling I've gotten when we've brought this out to market. I think part of it is that people are looking to scientists right now. That's who people trust, right? And that's kind of who we are at UL. We are a safety science company. I know that's what SafeTraces is all about too, right? It's all about science, and that's what people are looking. That's who people are looking to now. That they feel like they can trust. So I think the fact that people are saying, okay, so you're going to give me something that's sort of pragmatic, that works, that makes sense, and I'm dealing with UL and as a kind of a one-stop shop, and you're going to hold my hand and get me to where I need to go, instead of having it being this kind of cold, rigid auditing process. That's really impactful, and it kind of gives people this sense of relief, like somebody's here to kind of walk me through this and make me feel better, not just about the fact that I'm protected from a liability standpoint to a large degree, but also that I can go to bed at night knowing I'm not putting people in harm's way. I mean, nothing's perfect. There's no, force field you can put around a building, but this stuff we're talking about is really, really impactful to keeping people safe and productive and everything else. So that's been, quite honestly, there's two things. It's that sort of like sense of relief of, okay, this just became more sort of tangible and I can see the light at the end of the tunnel, but also the fact that, as we all know, the marketing piece and the perception piece is so important too, right? So being able to have that label that gives reassurance to people, that's kind of a, that's essentially a recognized name internationally as being all about safety and science and everything, is it just fits, so it's been a lot of fun so far, seeing the success and seeing how it's been taken up in the market, and seeing a lot of people quite satisfied at the tail end with what they have at the end of the day.
So do you see, given that many of the existing certification verification programs are focused on things other than health and wellness, and now are either trying to kind of adapt and add them, but a lot of the previous focus was on kind of greening buildings and sustainability, and then also the kind of more traditional operational type metrics and so forth of how thinking about a building. How do you Do you see tension between looking at a building from more of a health and wellness lens versus sustainability and greening, or are they kind of somewhat aligned, but there's key areas of tension? Like, how do you see those two kind of themes reconciling each other?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the most obvious one, I'm certainly not the first one to bring this up, but the most obvious one is the relationship between energy, both from a carbon footprint standpoint and from a cost standpoint, and wellness, right? Because everybody hears wellness is all about, to a large degree, this is true. Wellness is all about providing good indoor air, and you do that by and large, amongst other things, by ventilating with a lot of fresh air, and that's certainly true to a large extent. It has a great impact. Depending on where you are around the country or around the world, that can cost a lot of money. You're bringing in more fresh air, you're conditioning that air. Where's the balance? So in some degrees, yes, those things can kind of butt up against each other. I do think that there's a sweet spot. I think that sweet spot is going to be fluid, right? I think right now we need to kind of, worry a little less about energy consumption. I know it's hard for me to say as a sustainability guy, but we got to look at what's right in front of us and spending a little more on energy, especially at times where a lot of us are at home and we're using a lot less energy in buildings anyway. But let's compromise that a little bit for the better ventilation, but not in perpetuity. Let's find that sweet spot, and we kind of have a good idea where that is. But I guess the broader point is it doesn't need to. It does if you let it, but it's just about being smart and finding kind of the sweet spot when it comes to energy and wellness, really.
So as a tech company, we at SafeTraces are always kind of thinking about technology and what we do and what other technologies are out there in the marketplace. Interested to hear your thoughts on how technology factors into your business, and what emerging technologies you're excited about. I mean, you brought up a great point earlier that ultimately some of the traditional stuff is just as valid and important as it was years ago. Whereas, like, in some cases, there are some clear gaps and stuff is hitting the market, that's addressing some of those gaps. But like, what tech are you kind of paying attention to, and which ones do you think really can, move the field forward?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I will give you a little shout out here, Erik, and the work that SafeTraces is doing in that it's tech like that that's innovative, but it's about evaluating performance. I think is very impactful, right? Looking at new ways to evaluate performance that weren't around before. It kind of falls in that do no harm category as well, right? I do get a little nervous sometimes about some of the new technologies, and not necessarily as much about them doing potential harm, or although that is sometimes a concern, but it's the marketing claims out there. It's the it's the research that's kind of half baked or misrepresented. A lot of this stuff has a time and a place, but it's just understanding the application and not just going out and panicking and being knee jerk and falling in love with some marketing material thinking that you've found the secret recipe to solving all your problems, because that's not how it works, quite frankly. A lot of these supplemental things are great to consider in the right application, but again, being the boring guy, you got to focus on those fundamentals. And it's not just me saying it. Look at all the industry experts out there. They're saying, that piece, that fundamental piece, can often have 10 times as much impact as some supplemental thing you're going to bring into your building to try to make it better. I'm not saying you ignore those things. I'm just, again, hate to be a broken record, but it's incredibly important. Beyond that, I think, there are things that excite me. It's a little too early on to jump right in head first, but technologies like FAR UV, I'm really interested to learn more. I don't know if it's the solution to a lot of our problems in terms of infection control, but early studies are pretty exciting. You can imagine having lights in your light fixtures that are safe for people, but have the same impact as traditional UV and killing things in the air and on surfaces. A lot of research to still do there, but that certainly excites me. Thinking about smart buildings, right? And we've been playing with sensors for years. We've been using them for certain applications, and they're great in terms of monitoring everything from energy to water usage to indoor environmental quality contaminants. We're kind of at that cusp of getting to a place where you can get sensors that are worth the plastic they're encased in for once, and are affordable and can start doing things where they interact with building automation systems and whatnot to start making buildings smarter. I think that technology is here finally, and I think we're going to see huge evolution of that in the next 3 to 5 years. And I don't see that a threat to the business of what we do at all, quite honestly. I see it as a huge compliment. I think you're always going to need a trained eye to touch buildings and to assess what's going on. At the end of the day, sensors are just collecting data, right? And you have to know what to do with the data, and you also have to know how to react to the data. So I think there's really an exciting time right now when we see all this stuff come together and we just see better, smarter, healthier buildings. It's going to be, it's not going like this anymore. It's kind of a parabolic curve. It's going to start really, we're going to start seeing some really cool innovation, I think.
Yeah. So, and on that point, putting your prognosticator cap on. So over the next 5 to 10 years, what do you think is going to stay the same about the built environment, and what do you think is going to change, at the kind of macro level? Like, are we basically going to be in a similar point 10 years from now where we are today, or do you think we're going to see some real changes kind of brewing over the next few years?
It's a good question. I mean, I think it's inevitable that we'll see some changes. Some of them will be smart and work, and some of them maybe not so much. But I think this is too big of an event that we're going through right now to think that things are going to stay the same. I do think we're going to see a lot of innovative ideas in new buildings. I think we're going to see a lot more inclusion of natural ventilation where we can. But again, I think a refocus on our existing building, our existing buildings and how to refocus how we manage them is going to be huge. And not to mention that, you talk about a sudden shift. We've been through this whole, wellness movement over the past several years. We were kind of changing the way spaces looked, right? It was much more collaborative space, taking down partition walls and whatnot. And suddenly this happens and it's like, uh-oh, put on the brakes. We got to rethink this. And I don't think we're going to go back to those 6 foot tall cubicles necessarily, but I think there's going to be a lot more in terms of the mechanical systems and their ability to ventilate and filtrate. I think there's going to be a lot more natural ventilation, and I think there's going to be a lot more thoughtful design so that within the building, so that the next time something like this happens, we're again a little more prepared. Beyond that, it's hard to say. I mean, your guess is as good as mine, but I think we've got a lot of smart people who are putting their head down and really thinking about this, and that's the trying to be optimistic and glasses half full. That's kind of the silver lining in all this, is that through a catastrophe comes innovation and new ways of doing things, and I'm anxious to see what comes of it.
So where are you getting information from? Obviously you got to stay kind of really on top of what's going on in the market and in your business, and so you're interacting with customers, you're reading stuff, you're listening to stuff. Kind of, how are you getting information to keep you kind of on the tip of the spear in terms of what's going on?
Well, I'm lucky, Eric, because I've got a bunch of really smart people that I work with that do a lot of research. Not to mention that UL as a company is founded in research. So lucky for me, since I don't seem to have a lot of time these days, I don't really need to go perusing the web to try to sift through all the nonsense and find out what's real. And I have great researchers like Dr. Elliot Horner and Mark Carpenter and a whole slew of folks that kind of work on our core team with all this at UL that sift through all the nonsense and find what's important. But I would say for others out there, again, I know I said it before, but you have to stay away from the marketing, right? That's what's really important. You have to go to the agency guidelines, the folks that aren't trying to make a buck, you know, the ones that you hear over and over again, like the CDC and WHO. And I know there's been a little bit of wavering confidence in some of these organizations given what's happened with the pandemic, but you got to remember too that while some of this stuff may have been mismanaged a bit, it is a novel virus, meaning that, you know, nobody knew what the heck was going on. So missteps with something so impactful like this virus have to be kind of expected even from our, you know, our industry leaders. But it's folks like that, and of course EPA, ASHRAE is certainly a very useful resource. And I think one way to think of it is that anywhere you're getting your information, think about how defensible it is, right? And some marketing material from whomever isn't really defensible. Something from a governing agency or a standard that is you know, not for profit and whatnot. That stuff is real and certainly more defensible. And that's where I like to look.
Well, so just to close out here, where can listeners find out more information about UL's healthy building services and offerings, the verification mark program, and how can they follow up with you or your colleagues if they want to get in touch and pursue anything?
Sure. Well, I'm very happy and excited and humbled to say that as of a few days ago, our UL verification mark has taken the front page of the main landing page for ul.com. So that's a very simple way to start. It's front and center. Lots of information there on what the program is all about. If anybody's interested in seeing scope and pricing, it's very simple. There's no commitment to do so. You can simply go to ul.com/verify my building and get everything you need there. And lastly, you can reach out to me directly, and my email address is sean.mccrady@ul.com, and I'll be happy to answer any questions or filter you to the right person to do so.
Cool. Well, this has been fantastic. I guess just to close out, I mean, any final parting thoughts or topics that you wanted to cover that we didn't get a chance to?
No, I think we did a pretty good job of covering everything. I just, again, I hope we all learn from this whole process and really, you know, be mindful moving forward. And I think the next time something like this happens that we're going through right now, unfortunately, I don't think it's going to be another 100 years like it was this time. But I think if we all just, you know, be mindful and do some things that are not, you know, incredibly laborious and expensive and just do the tried and true and be smart, I think we'll be much better prepared in the future. So I hope we all learn from this.
Yeah.
And thank you, Eric. Thanks for having me on.
Well, we're really grateful. We know how busy your schedule is these days. So thanks so much for taking time, for sharing your perspective, and for everything that you're doing. And you know, we look forward to being in touch and seeing where your program goes. So thank you.